I thought I understood love, steady, safe, and unchanging. But with Ethan, my best friend, everything shifted. The night we crossed the line between friendship and something more was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. In his arms, I found vulnerability and passion I didn't know I needed. But with that intimacy came questions. Could we risk everything for love? Or would the leap shatter the bond we'd always cherished? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from. And if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Milo lay sprawled across the rug in my living room, his golden fur glowing in the soft light of the lamp. He gave a little sigh, rolling onto his back with his tail swishing lazily against the floor. I couldn't help but smile. Milo was my anchor, my ever-constant in a world that often felt like it was spinning just a little too fast. Tonight, though, it wasn't the world making me uneasy. It was Ethan. Ethan sat across from me on the couch, nursing a soda he hadn't taken a sip from in 20 minutes. His hazel eyes were fixed on the TV, but I could tell he wasn't really watching. His usual easygoing grin had been replaced by something quieter, something more thoughtful. I shifted in my seat, pulling the sleeves of my sweater over my hands. "Okay, out with it," I said, breaking the silence. "You've been weird all night. What's going on?" Ethan glanced at me, his tousled dark brown hair falling over his forehead in that way that made him look simultaneously boyish and brooding. "Weird? I'm not weird. You're definitely weird," I said, tilting my head toward Milo, who was now watching Ethan with curious, dark brown eyes. "Even Milo can tell." Ethan chuckled softly, the sound easing a little of the tension in the room. "I'm just thinking." "That's never good," I teased, hoping to lighten the mood. But his expression didn't change, and my stomach twisted with the unfamiliar tension between us. Ethan wasn't supposed to be serious. Ethan was supposed to be my rock, my steady, unshakable best friend. "What are you thinking about?" I asked softer this time. He hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his flannel shirt. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant to be something more?" The room seemed to go still. Even Milo stopped wagging his tail. I blinked at Ethan. Sure, I'd misheard him. "Something more," I repeated, forcing a laugh. "Like what, business partners? Because I'm not sure the world's ready for our dog-walking empire." Ethan smiled, but it was faint and it didn't reach his eyes. "You know what I mean, Sophie." I didn't. Or maybe I did and I wasn't ready to face it. My fingers tightened around the mug in my hands as I struggled to find something, anything to say. The silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. "I think you've been watching too many romantic comedies," I joked weakly, finally breaking the quiet. "Next thing I know, you'll be standing outside my window with a boombox." Ethan shook his head, leaning back on the couch. "Forget I said anything," he muttered. "I'm probably just overthinking." But I couldn't forget it. His words stayed with me for the rest of the evening, unspoken but heavy, like a thread stretched too tightly. We talked and laughed and pretended everything was normal, but the air between us was different now, fragile as though one wrong move could shatter it. Later, after Ethan had left and Milo had curled up beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying his question over and over. "Do you ever wonder if we're meant to be something more?" I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to find one. I didn't sleep much after Ethan left that night. His words replayed in my mind like a broken record, each repetition making them heavier, harder to ignore. Something more? It wasn't just what he said. It was the way he said it, quietly, like he wasn't sure if he even wanted me to hear it. Milo lay beside me on the couch, his steady breathing the only sound in the otherwise silent room. I absently stroked his silky fur, finding a small comfort in the way his tail thumped softly every time my fingers reached his favorite spot behind his ear. "What do you think, buddy?" asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Am I crazy for overthinking this?" Milo didn't answer, of course, but he gave a little wag of his tail as if to say, "You're always overthinking." The next morning, I gave up on sleep and made coffee, scrolling through my phone as Milo nosed at my leg for attention. My finger hovered over a folder of old photos labeled Ethan and Milo, and before I could stop myself, I opened it. The first photo was one Ethan had taken the day I brought Milo home. I'd been heartbroken over a breakup, my confidence shattered and my future feeling uncertain. Adopting Milo had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, one I wasn't entirely sure I was ready for. But the second I saw his wiggly little self at the shelter, I knew I couldn't leave without him. That night, Ethan showed up at my apartment with his arms full of supplies. A dog bed, chew toys, treats, even a leash. "Figured you might need some reinforcements," he said with a grin as Milo immediately started chewing on the leash still in the package. I smiled at the memory. Swiping to the next photo. Ethan sitting cross-legged on the floor, Milo sprawled across his lap, fast asleep. Ethan had looked up at me then, his hazel eyes warm with amusement. "You might have rescued him," he said. "But I think he's the one rescuing you." Ethan had always been there. From late-night calls when I was overwhelmed with school to showing up unannounced with coffee on the mornings he knew I needed it most, he was my constant. That's why his question last night unsettled me so much. Ethan wasn't supposed to ask things like that. Ethan was supposed to be my safe space, my solid ground. But now I didn't know what we were anymore. Later that day, Ethan texted me. "Ethan, movie night tomorrow? Milo gets first pick." "Me sure. He's voting for something with squirrels." I stared at my phone for a long time after sending the message, trying to read between the lines of his invitation. Was he pretending everything was normal? Or was I the one making it weird? Milo padded into the room, his tail wagging as he hopped up onto the couch beside me. I buried my face in his fur, breathing in his familiar warmth. "What am I supposed to do, Milo?" I murmured. He responded by nudging my hand with his nose, his tail wagging harder. When Ethan showed up the next night, he was carrying popcorn and Milo's favorite treats, just like always. For a moment, everything felt normal again. "Man's best friend gets priority," Ethan said, tossing Milo a treat as he settled onto the couch. We fell into our usual rhythm, debating over which movie to watch, stealing the last handfuls of popcorn from each other, and laughing at Milo's antics as he tried to squeeze himself onto the couch between us. But every now and then I'd catch Ethan looking at me. Not in the usual way, like when he was about to make a joke at my expense. This was different, softer, quieter. And every time I noticed it, my chest tightened. "What?" I finally asked, breaking the tension. Ethan shrugged, his gaze dropping to the bowl of popcorn in his lap. "Nothing. Just, you're good with him, you know? Milo, you're good with everyone." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. But the way he said it, like it was more than just a compliment, stayed with me long after the movie ended. After Ethan left that night, I sat on the couch with Milo curled up beside me. I ran my fingers absently through his fur, my mind replaying every look, every word. I'd always thought I knew where I stood with Ethan. But now, for the first time, I wasn't so sure. By the time the weekend arrived, I had convinced myself that Ethan's question didn't mean anything. It couldn't. We were best friends, and that's all we'd ever been. The idea of something more between us, it didn't fit. At least, that's what I told myself every time my mind wandered back to his words. That night, we were heading to a friend's birthday party. Something Ethan and I had done 100 times before. Normally, these events were our thing, an excuse to hang out, laugh, and people watch. But this time, something felt different. I couldn't tell if it was him, me, or both. The party was already in full swing when we arrived, string lights casting a warm glow over the backyard. Laughter and music filled the air, and the scent of grilled food wafted through the crisp evening breeze. Ethan and I exchanged a glance as we stepped inside the gate, Milo staying home for this one. "You ready to explain why we're late?" Ethan asked with a smirk. His dark brown hair was slightly windswept, and the sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up, revealing his lean forearms. I laughed, grateful for the moment of normalcy. "You mean why you couldn't find your keys?" "Details, Sophie," he teased, nudging me lightly with his elbow. For a moment, things felt like they always did, easy, comfortable. But as we mingled with friends and the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I was standing by the drink table, chatting with a group of friends when the teasing began. "So, how long have you two been married?" Sarah asked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "What?" I blurted, nearly spilling my drink. "You and Ethan," she said, motioning toward him across the yard. "I mean, come on. You're practically joined at the hip." Everyone assumes you're a couple. I forced a laugh, my cheeks burning. We're not, Ethan's my best friend. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Sure. Whatever you say. The comment stuck with me, and when I finally caught up with Ethan later, it was clear something had shifted. He was standing by the fence, chatting with a few people, but his usual easy smile was absent. When our eyes met, he gave me a small nod, but it felt distant. You okay? I asked as I joined him. Yeah, he said, his gaze flicking toward the ground. You? Fine, I said, though my voice came out sharper than I intended. I didn't know why I was upset. Maybe it was Sarah's comment, or the way Ethan was acting, or the way I couldn't seem to figure out what was happening between us. Before I could say anything else, another friend joined us, pulling Ethan into a conversation. I stood there for a moment, feeling out of place, before retreating back to the drink table. The night didn't get any easier. Ethan kept his distance, and I couldn't decide if he was avoiding me or if I was avoiding him. By the time we left the party, the silence between us was heavy. Did you have fun? I asked as we walked to the car, the words feeling hollow. Yeah, Ethan said, his voice equally empty. Neither of us said much after that. When I got home, Milo greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, his tail wagging as he nudged me with his nose. I sank onto the couch, burying my face in his fur. What's happening, Milo? I whispered. Did I mess this up? Milo gave a little huff, resting his head on my lap as if to say, you're overthinking again. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that things between Ethan and me would go back to normal, that I was imagining the distance growing between us. But deep down I wasn't so sure. The next day I debated texting Ethan. Part of me wanted to clear the air, but another part of me was afraid of what I might hear. What if I'd misunderstood everything? What if he had? What if I'd already ruined the one thing I couldn't bear to lose? I finally sent a message. Me, hey, everything okay? His reply was quick but short. Ethan, yeah, just busy. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. Ethan was never just busy. He always made time for me, for us. But now he was pulling away and I didn't know why or how to stop it. For the next few days, things didn't get better. We barely talked, and when we did, it felt forced, like we were trying too hard to pretend nothing had changed. Milo stayed close to me during those moments, his presence a quiet comfort. When Ethan finally showed up unannounced at my door, I didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. Hey, he said, his voice softer than usual. Can we talk? I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. Milo wagged his tail as Ethan crouched down to greet him, scratching behind his ears like he always did. But even Milo seemed to sense the tension in the air. Ethan stood, his hands in his pockets, his gaze darting around the room. I feel like I've been screwing this up, he said. What are you talking about? Asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. This, he said, gesturing between us. Us. I've been overthinking everything, and I don't know how to fix it. I took a deep breath, my fingers curling into Milo's fur. Ethan, I don't even know what's wrong. You've been acting different. Because I don't know where we stand anymore, he admitted, his hazel eyes meeting mine. And I'm scared of ruining it. His words hit me harder than I expected, and for the first time in days, I felt like we were finally getting somewhere. Ethan stood in my living room, his hands shoved into his pockets and his hazel eyes darting everywhere but at me. Milo sat between us, his golden fur shimmering in the soft glow of the lamp. He looked up at Ethan, then back at me, his tail wagging softly as if trying to diffuse the tension. I don't know where to start, Ethan said finally, his voice low. I've been holding this in for so long and I don't know if I'm ready for what happens next. I crossed my arms, trying to steady my breathing. His words felt heavy, loaded with something I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Just say it, I said softly, my voice steadier than I expected. Whatever it is, Ethan, just say it. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark brown hair, making it stick up in places. Do you remember last year when I disappeared for a while? You thought I was busy with work. I nodded. Yeah. You were off the radar for weeks. Thought, I don't know, maybe you needed space. It wasn't work, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I was struggling, sophomore. With everything. Life, work, myself. I felt like I was sinking, and I didn't know how to ask for help. I stared at him, the weight of his confession sinking into me. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered. You could have talked to me, Ethan. You've always been able to talk to me. I didn't want to burden you, he said, his hazel eyes finally meeting mine. But then you left Milo with me for that weekend and, I don't know. He just helped. He didn't judge, didn't ask questions. He was just there. I glanced down at Milo, my chest tightening as he wagged his tail, seemingly oblivious to the role he'd played in Ethan's life. Ethan crouched down, running his hand through Milo's fur. He kept me going, you know? There were nights I'd just sit with him and he'd look at me like I mattered. Like I wasn't a failure. You've never been a failure, I said, my voice breaking. Not to me. Ethan's shoulders tensed and he looked up at me, his hazel eyes filled with a vulnerability I'd never seen before. You've always been there for me, sophomore, even when you didn't know it. And I think that's part of why I'm so scared. Scared of what? I asked, taking a step closer. Scared of losing you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Scared that if we try to be something more, and it doesn't work, I'll lose the only person who's ever made me feel whole. Milo chose that moment to nudge Ethan's hand, his tail wagging harder as he looked between us. It was like he could feel the weight of the conversation, like he was trying to push us toward something neither of us was ready to say. I let out a shaky laugh, wiping at the tears I hadn't realized were falling. Milo has terrible timing. Ethan smiled faintly, his hand resting on Milo's head. Or maybe he's better at this than we are. For a moment the tension broke, replaced by something softer. I sat down on the couch and Ethan followed, Milo squeezing himself between us like a fluffy referee. We both reached for him at the same time, our hands brushing as we scratched behind his ears. You know what I think? I said after a long silence, my voice tentative. I think we've been scared of the same thing. Scared of losing what we have because it means so much to us. Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on Milo. Yeah, I think you're right. But maybe, I continued, my voice growing steadier, maybe the fact that we're scared means it's worth it. Maybe it means it's something we can't ignore. Ethan looked up at me then, his hazel eyes searching mine. Do you really think we can figure this out? Without losing everything? I smiled, reaching over to take his hand. I think we can try. Milo let out a little huff, his tail wagging furiously now, and we both laughed, the sound light and full of relief. For the first time in weeks I felt like we were finally on the same page. The fear, the uncertainty, it was still there, but now it felt manageable, like something we could face together. As Ethan leaned back against the couch, Milo curled up between us, I realized something else. This wasn't just about what we could lose. It was about what we could gain. And for the first time I felt ready to take that chance. The next morning I sat at the kitchen table, wrapping my hands around a warm mug of coffee. The sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in soft golden light. Milo was curled up at my feet, snoring gently, his golden fur catching the sunlight. Ethan sat across from me, stirring his coffee absently. He hadn't said much since he'd come over last night, but the silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It felt reflective, like we were both letting the weight of our conversation settle. Can I ask you something? He said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Of course, I said, looking up at him. His hazel eyes met mine, steady but cautious. Do you regret any of it? He asked. Last night. What we talked about. I set my mug down, leaning forward slightly. No, I said, shaking my head. I don't regret it. If anything, I feel lighter, like we're finally being honest with each other. Ethan nodded, his gaze dropping to the coffee mug in his hands. I guess I didn't realize how much I needed to say all of that. I've been holding it in for so long. And Milo was the one who helped you through it, I said softly, glancing down at the dog who had been such a constant in both our lives. You know, I always thought I rescued him, but maybe it's the other way around. Ethan smiled faintly, his gaze softening. He has a way of knowing what people need. He always has. We spent the morning talking not just about us, but about everything we'd kept bottled up for years. Ethan told me more about the struggles he'd faced last year. The overwhelming pressure at work, the nights he felt like he couldn't breathe, the way Milo had been his only anchor. I didn't know how to tell you, he admitted. You were dealing with your own stuff, and I didn't want to make things harder for you. You wouldn't have, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Ethan, you've always been there for me. I wish you'd let me be there for you too. You were there, he said softly, even when you didn't know it. Milo stretched and yawned, wagging his tail as he nudged my leg. I reached down to scratch behind his ears, smiling as Ethan leaned down to do the same. Our hands brushed again, and this time neither of us pulled away. I'm scared, Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. Me too, I admitted. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being scared just means it matters. He looked at me then. His hazel eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or relief. I think you're right, he said. About all of it. We finished our coffee in silence. But it wasn't the kind of silence that needed to be filled. It was the kind of silence that felt like the beginning of something new. The park was quiet, bathed in the soft amber glow of the setting sun. Milo bounded ahead of us, his golden fur shining as he darted between trees, stopping every so often to sniff at something new. His tail wagged furiously, a blur of joy against the tranquil backdrop. Ethan and I walked side by side along the gravel path, the crunch of our footsteps the only sound between us. For once, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't weighed down by the questions or fears that had followed us for weeks. It was easy, comfortable, like it used to be, but different. Better. I glanced over at him, catching the way the golden light played against his profile. His dark brown hair was tousled by the evening breeze, and his hazel eyes reflected the colors of the sunset. He caught me looking and smiled, his expression soft. What? He asked, his voice warm. Nothing, I said, smiling back. I'm just happy. He nodded, his gaze drifting to Milo, who was now chasing a falling leaf. Me too. We reached a small bench overlooking the park's pond, and Milo trotted back to us, his tongue lolling happily. He plopped down at our feet, his tail thumping against the ground as if urging us to sit. Ethan gestured to the bench. Shall we? I nodded, and we sat down, our shoulders brushing lightly. The pond in front of us shimmered with the reflection of the sunset, the colors rippling softly in the breeze. Milo stretched out between us, letting out a contented sigh. This feels nice, I said after a while. Being here. Like this. It does, Ethan agreed. He hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about being scared because it matters. And? I asked, my voice quiet. And I think you were right, he said. The things that scare us the most are usually the ones worth fighting for. I turned to him, my heart swelling at the sincerity in his hazel eyes. I'm glad you think so. Ethan smiled, leaning forward slightly. So where do we go from here? I reached down, my fingers brushing against Milo's fur. Wherever this takes us, I said. One step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in soft twilight, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Milo's tail wagged softly, Ethan's hand brushed mine, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of what came next.